piercing screams echoed through the marble corridors of the Henderson mansion at 3:47 a.m. when Isabella Martinez, the night maid, did something that made billionaire tech mogul David Henderson drop to his knees and weep. She whispered 3 words in Spanish to his inconsolable 6-month-old daughter Emma, and for the first time in 4 months, the baby fell silent. Before we continue, if you enjoy incredible true stories that will restore your faith in human connection, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. 4 months earlier, Emma Henderson had been the picture of perfect health. Born to David Henderson, founder of Technova Industries worth $2.3 billion, and his wife Sarah, a former pediatric nurse turned philanthropist, Emma should have wanted for nothing. The Henderson estate in Beverly Hills boasted a fully equipped nursery designed by Europe's top child development specialists, complete with air purification systems, temperature controls, and every technological advancement money could buy. The walls were painted in calming sage green with hand-painted murals of peaceful forest scenes. A state-of-the-art sound system played carefully curated classical music designed to promote infant brain development. Sarah had spent months researching every detail of Emma's environment. The crib mattress was made from organic materials sourced from a monastery in Switzerland. The mobile above Emma's bed featured hand-carved wooden animals that moved to the rhythm of Brahms' lullabies. Even Emma's clothing was selected for optimal comfort and development, made from the finest organic cotton and designed by pediatric specialists. David had installed monitoring systems that tracked Emma's sleep patterns, breathing, and movement with military precision. Multiple cameras provided 24-hour surveillance, and sensors measured everything from room humidity to air quality. The nursery represented the pinnacle of modern parenting technology, a monument to their determination to give their daughter every possible advantage. But technology couldn't solve what happened next. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah Henderson found her daughter screaming in her crib with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't ordinary crying. Emma's face turned purple, her tiny fists clenched so tightly her knuckles went white, and her screams carried a desperation that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. Dr. Patricia Williamson, Beverly Hills' most renowned pediatrician, arrived within the hour. Her examination revealed nothing abnormal. Emma's vitals were perfect, her reflexes normal, her development on track. Yet the screaming continued, hour after hour, with only brief moments of exhausted silence before starting again. Dr. Williamson conducted a thorough examination, checking Emma's ears for infections, her abdomen for signs of colic, her skin for rashes or irritations. She observed Emma's crying patterns, noting the intensity and duration. The baby's screams weren't the typical fussiness of colic or hunger. They carried a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical discomfort. Sometimes babies go through difficult phases, Dr. Williamson assured the frantic parents. This could be a severe case of colic, though it's unusual in its intensity. Try changing her formula, adjust her feeding schedule, and make sure she's getting enough sleep. But nothing worked. Different formulas made no difference. Feeding schedules were impossible to maintain when Emma refused to eat while screaming. Sleep became a fantasy for the entire household. Day after day, Emma screamed. The sound became the soundtrack of the Henderson household, a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong, even though no one could identify what. The beautiful nursery that had been designed as a sanctuary became a torture chamber where parents took shifts, holding their inconsolable daughter, praying for even 5 minutes of silence. David Henderson, a man accustomed to solving complex problems with logic and resources, threw everything at the situation. He flew in specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Neurologists, gastroenterologists, sleep specialists, and child psychologists all examined Emma. Every test came back normal. Every scan showed a perfectly healthy baby. Dr. Michael Chen, a renowned pediatric neurologist from Boston Children's Hospital, spent 3 days at the Henderson estate conducting comprehensive tests. He performed EEGs to check for seizure activity, MRIs to examine Emma's brain structure, and sleep studies to analyze her patterns. All results were completely normal. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a gastroenterologist specializing in infant digestive issues, investigated every possible cause of intestinal distress, upper GI, series, ultrasounds, stool samples, blood work examining for food allergies and intolerances. Nothing indicated any physical cause for Emma's distress. The sleep specialist, Dr. James Morrison, observed Emma for 48 hours straight, documenting her crying patterns, environmental responses, and brief moments of rest. His conclusion was bewildering. Emma showed no signs of any recognized sleep disorders, yet she seemed incapable of achieving peaceful rest. Dr. Angela Foster, a child psychologist with 30 years of experience, suggested that Emma might be exhibiting early signs of sensory processing disorder or autism spectrum behaviors. But Emma's responses to touch, sound, and visual stimuli were completely appropriate for her age. She made eye contact, responded to familiar voices, and showed normal reflexes. Her screaming seemed to be her only abnormal behavior. David spent over $400,000 on medical consultations, tests, and treatments. He brought in specialists from Switzerland, Japan, and Germany. Each expert arrived with confidence and left with confusion. Emma Henderson remained a medical mystery wrapped in inconsolable crying. But healthy babies don't scream for 16 hours a day. Sarah stopped sleeping entirely. The former nurse in her analyzed every cry, every movement, searching for clues that medical degrees couldn't uncover. She tried different formulas, adjusted room temperatures, changed Emma's clothing, and held her daughter for hours until her arms ached and her back seized with pain. She researched obscure conditions online, reading medical journals until her eyes burned, desperately searching for answers that continued to elude her. Sarah began keeping detailed logs of Emma's crying, patterns, noting the time, duration, intensity, and any possible triggers. She recorded everything Emma ate, every diaper change, every environmental change. The logs filled 3 notebooks with meticulous observations that revealed no patterns whatsoever. Nothing worked. The guilt consumed her like acid eating through her soul. As a pediatric nurse, she had comforted hundreds of children through illness, injury, and trauma. She had calmed colicky babies, soothed feverish toddlers, and helped families navigate medical crises. Parents had praised her intuitive understanding of children's needs. Why couldn't she comfort her own daughter? What kind of mother was she if she couldn't provide peace for her own baby? The guilt manifested physically. Sarah developed chronic headaches that no medication could touch. Her appetite disappeared completely, and she lost 20 pounds in 3 weeks. Dark circles shadowed her eyes so deeply that makeup couldn't cover them. Her hands developed a constant tremor from exhaustion and stress. When she looked in mirrors, she saw a stranger, someone hollow and desperate who bore no resemblance to the confident woman she had been just months before. David watched his wife deteriorate with growing alarm. Sarah had always been the emotional anchor of their relationship, the one who could find solutions where he saw only problems. Watching her confidence crumble was almost as devastating as Emma's crying. The vibrant woman he married was disappearing, replaced by someone whose eyes held a haunted quality that frightened him. Their marriage, once built on shared dreams and mutual support, began fracturing under the pressure of helplessness. Conversations became tense exchanges about medical appointments and failed solutions. They stopped touching each other, stopped sharing meals, stopped connecting in any meaningful way. The distance between them grew wider each day, filled with unspoken blame and mutual failure. David threw himself deeper into work, spending 18-hour days at Technova offices to escape the sound of Emma's crying and the sight of Sarah's pain. When he was home, he felt completely useless. All his success in business, all his ability to analyze and solve complex problems, meant nothing when faced with his daughter's inexplicable distress. Sarah interpreted David's increased work hours as abandonment, confirming her growing belief that she was failing as both a mother and a wife. She stopped calling him during the day, stopped asking for help, and began treating him like a distant roommate rather than her partner in parenting. The Henderson household staff, initially sympathetic, began requesting transfers to other positions within David's company empire. Maria Santos, their longtime housekeeper, asked to be reassigned to David's downtown office building. James Wright, their groundskeeper for 8 years, requested a position maintaining David's commercial properties. Even Mrs. Patricia Coleman, Sarah's personal assistant who had worked for the family for 6 years, submitted a resignation letter citing personal reasons. The constant screaming created an atmosphere of tension that permeated every room of the mansion. Staff members developed headaches, sleep disturbances, and anxiety symptoms from prolonged exposure to Emma's cries. Conversations became whispered exchanges in distant corners of the house, and employees began wearing earphones or earplugs while working. The mansion that once hosted charity galas for 300 guests and business meetings with international clients fell silent except for Emma's cries. Social invitations stopped coming. Friends made excuses to avoid visiting. The Hendersons became increasingly isolated, trapped in their beautiful home with a mystery that no amount of money or expertise could solve. Isabella Martinez arrived on a Thursday evening in late June, hired through an emergency staffing agency when the third nanny quit without notice. At 28, Isabella possessed a quiet strength that immediately distinguished her from the previous caregivers who had fled the Henderson household in defeat. Born in Guadalajara, Mexico, she had immigrated to Los Angeles 12 years earlier with her younger brother Miguel after their parents died in a car accident that left them orphaned and alone. Isabella's journey to America had been fraught with challenges that most of the Henderson staff couldn't imagine. She and 15-year-old Miguel had crossed the border with fake documents and $300 sewn into Isabella's jacket lining. They stayed in a cramped apartment with 8 other people in East Los Angeles, sleeping on mattresses onto the floor and sharing one bathroom among 10 residents. Isabella's background differed drastically from the typical Henderson staff, who came with polished resumes and references from other wealthy families. While other employees had attended prestigious universities or specialized training programs, Isabella's education came from survival and necessity. She had raised Miguel from age 10 when he was grieving, angry, and speaking no English, working multiple jobs to keep them both fed and housed. She cleaned offices at night, her hands growing raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, while she learned English from cleaning crew supervisors who took pity on her determination. During morning hours, she worked at a daycare in Koreatown, where the owner, Mrs. Kim, recognized Isabella's natural gift with difficult children. Mrs. Kim became Isabella's unofficial mentor, teaching her about child development, while Isabella helped manage 20 toddlers with patience that seemed supernatural. Evenings were reserved for community college ESL classes, where Isabella studied grammar and vocabulary with the same intensity other students reserved for law or medicine. She carried index cards with English words everywhere, practicing pronunciation while riding buses between jobs and during brief breaks at work. When Miguel was struggling in high school, getting into fights and skipping classes, Isabella found ways to reach him that counselors and teachers couldn't. She understood that his anger came from grief and displacement, not defiance. She sat with him during his rage, held him during his tears, and never stopped believing he could build a better future. Miguel graduated high school with honors and earned a full scholarship to UCLA, majoring in engineering. The day he walked across that graduation stage, Isabella allowed herself to cry tears of relief and pride. She had kept her promise to their parents to protect and guide her younger brother. Only then did she feel free to pursue work that utilized her natural gifts with children rather than just survival. Her first night at the Henderson estate, Isabella stood in the marble foyer, listening to Emma's screams echo through the corridors. The sound was indeed different from typical infant crying, carrying an intensity and desperation that seemed to fill every corner of the massive house. Other staff members hurried past with pained expressions, but Isabella paused, tilting her head and really listening to what the baby might be trying to communicate. Sarah answered the door to the nursery, looking like a ghost of herself. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the rocking chair, and her eyes held a wild quality that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much unanswered desperation. "Are you the new nanny?" Sarah asked with barely contained hope mixed with pessimism. She had been disappointed too many times to allow herself full optimism. Isabella looked around the nursery, taking in the expensive equipment, the perfect temperature control, the carefully curated environment designed to promote infant development. Everything was technically perfect, yet the room felt heavy with tension and unexpressed emotion. "I'm Isabella. May I hold her?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then handed over Emma with a mixture of hope and defeat. Isabella took Emma gently, positioning her against her chest in a way that seemed instinctive rather than learned. She didn't try to stop the crying immediately or offer solutions. Instead, she simply held the baby and listened, her eyes closed in concentration. Emma's screaming continued, but Isabella didn't flinch or try to quiet her right away. She walked slowly around the room, whispering softly in Spanish, not trying to solve or fix, just being present with the baby's distress. Her presence seemed to shift something in the room's energy, though Emma's cries didn't diminish in volume. After 20 minutes, Emma's cries softened slightly from screaming to intense crying, though they didn't stop entirely. It was the first time in weeks that Emma's volume had decreased even marginally without her falling unconscious from exhaustion. "She's trying to tell us something," Isabella said quietly to Sarah. "But I don't think it's about her body. Sometimes babies carry things that adults miss." Sarah looked at Isabella with confusion mixed with desperate curiosity. "What do you mean?" "In my family, we believe babies are more sensitive to feelings than adults. They absorb everything around them. Sometimes when they cry like this, they're reflecting something in the environment that adults have learned to ignore." David, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. His expression showed polite skepticism. As a tech entrepreneur, he solved problems with data and logic. Folk wisdom from the Maid seemed unlikely to succeed where medical science had failed. Over the following days, Isabella established a routine unlike anything the previous caregivers had attempted. Instead of trying to quiet Emma immediately, she created what she called listening time. She would hold Emma while the baby screamed, whispering observations in both Spanish and English about what she noticed in the household. Isabella's approach was methodical, but intuitive. She walked through each room of the mansion while holding Emma, paying attention to how the baby's crying changed in different spaces. In David's study, Emma's cries became sharper, more agitated. In the kitchen, they softened slightly, but in Sarah's bedroom, Emma's screams reached their peak intensity, as if responding to something invisible but powerful in that space. "The house feels heavy," Isabella told Sarah on her third day, while Emma continued crying in her arms. There's sadness in the walls, not just from Emma crying, but older sadness, like grief that hasn't been expressed. And sometimes when babies cry like this, they're reflecting feelings that adults carry but don't speak about. Isabella had learned this from her abuela, her grandmother, who had raised 11 children in Guadalajara and served as an unofficial midwife and counselor for women in their neighborhood. Abuela Martinez had taught Isabella that babies were like emotional mirrors, reflecting back the feelings that adults worked hard to hide or suppress. Children don't know how to protect themselves from feelings the way adults do, Isabella explained to Sarah. They absorb everything around them, especially from their mothers. If there's pain in the house that hasn't been acknowledged, sensitive babies will carry it until someone helps them understand it's not theirs to bear. Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. She stepped back from Isabella as if she'd been slapped, her face going pale. That's ridiculous. This house is filled with love. We've wanted Emma for years. We've given her everything. Her voice carried defensiveness that seemed disproportionate to Isabella's gentle observation. But Isabella's words had touched something Sarah had buried so deep, she had almost convinced herself it didn't exist. The truth she hadn't spoken to anyone, including David. The truth that made Emma's crying feel like an accusation rather than a cry for help, like a judgment of her worthiness as a mother. Emma hadn't been their first baby. 2 years earlier, Sarah had been pregnant with their first child, a son they planned to name Michael David Henderson. The pregnancy had been planned and celebrated, announced at David's company Christmas party with champagne toasts and congratulations from friends who knew how long they had been trying to conceive. Sarah had documented every week of the pregnancy, with photos and journal entries. She talked to Michael constantly, describing the world he would soon enter, the adventures they would share, the love that awaited him. David would place his hands on her growing belly each night, telling his son about the business he would one day inherit, the education they would provide, the opportunities that awaited him. They had transformed the guest room into a nursery, painted soft blue with clouds on the ceiling. Sarah spent hours researching baby gear, reading parenting books, and planning Michael's future with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything in her life. They bought a crib, a changing table, and a rocking chair where Sarah would sit and plan their son's life. At 28 weeks, during a routine ultrasound appointment, Dr. Williamson's expression changed in a way that made Sarah's blood freeze. The technician called for additional imaging, then called for another doctor. Sarah gripped David's hand as medical professionals exchanged glances, heavy with meaning she didn't want to understand. Michael had severe neural tube defects that had somehow been missed in earlier screenings. His brain had not developed properly, and his spine was severely malformed. The conditions were incompatible with life outside the womb. If he survived birth, which was unlikely, he would live in constant pain with no cognitive function, unable to see, hear, or recognize his parents. Dr. Williamson explained the options with clinical compassion that felt like ice in Sarah's veins. They could continue the pregnancy, knowing their son would suffer tremendously for whatever brief time he survived. Or they could terminate to spare him that suffering and spare themselves the trauma of watching their child die slowly and painfully. The decision tore Sarah apart from the inside out. As a pediatric nurse, she had seen children with various conditions and understood the reality of what Michael's life would entail. She had comforted families through similar diagnoses, watching parents struggle with impossible choices. She knew the medical facts, understood the prognosis, and could see clearly that continuing the pregnancy would only prolong everyone's suffering. But as a mother, the thought of ending her son's life felt like the ultimate betrayal. She had promised to protect him, to love him unconditionally, to be his advocate against the world. How could she choose to end his existence before giving him a chance to fight? David supported whatever decision she made, but Sarah could see his practical nature leaning toward the medical recommendation. He asked questions about quality of life, about the resources required for Michael's care, about the impact on any future children they might have. His analytical approach to the crisis felt like abandonment to Sarah, though she understood he was trying to process an impossible situation in the only way he knew how. Sarah spent 2 weeks in agony, researching Michael's conditions obsessively, consulting with specialists, and praying for a miracle that never came. Every test confirmed the same devastating reality. Their son's life would be brief and filled with suffering if he survived at all. They scheduled the procedure for a rainy Thursday in October. Sarah remembered every detail of that day with painful clarity. The gray sky that matched her mood, the gentle rain that felt like tears from heaven, the way David's hand shook as he signed the consent forms. The medical procedure itself was quick and professional, but the emotional aftermath stretched on indefinitely. Sarah never allowed herself to grieve properly. She threw herself back into work within days, volunteering for extra shifts in difficult cases that kept her mind occupied. She researched fertility treatments, planned their next attempt at parenthood, and focused obsessively on the future to avoid dwelling on the loss. David followed her lead, avoiding discussions about Michael and channeling his pain into expanding his business empire. They never spoke about the nursery they had dismantled, the baby clothes they had donated, or the dreams they had buried with their son. When Emma was conceived 8 months later, Sarah approached the pregnancy with a mixture of joy and terror. Every ultrasound was an exercise in anxiety. Every kick was a reminder of Michael's absence. When Emma was born healthy and perfect, Sarah thought she had successfully moved past the loss and earned her right to happiness through careful planning and medical vigilance. But guilt had been waiting, dormant but powerful, for the right trigger. Emma's inconsolable crying felt like cosmic justice, punishment for the choice she had made with Michael. Deep in her subconscious, Sarah believed she didn't deserve a healthy baby after choosing to end her first pregnancy, even though the choice had been made out of love and mercy. Isabella recognized the signs because she had seen them before, in her own life and in the families where she had worked during her years in Los Angeles. Unresolved grief creates an energy that sensitive children absorb like sponges absorbing water. Emma wasn't crying because something was wrong with her physically or developmentally. She was crying because she could feel her mother's unresolved pain and guilt, and in her infant wisdom, she was trying to help her family heal from a wound they hadn't acknowledged existed. During Isabella's 4th week with the family, she noticed that Emma's crying intensified whenever Sarah entered the room, but not from recognition or hunger. The baby seemed to be responding to something deeper, some emotional frequency that Sarah was broadcasting unconsciously. Isabella had seen this before with other families carrying unexpressed losses. "You lost a baby before Emma," Isabella said quietly to Sarah one evening, as Emma's cries filled the nursery for the 15th consecutive hour. It wasn't a question. Isabella's tone carried no judgment, only gentle certainty and infinite compassion. Sarah's composure finally cracked like a dam bursting under too much pressure. The tears she had held back for 2 years poured out as she told Isabella about Michael, about the ultrasound that changed everything, about the impossible choice between prolonging suffering and ending a life. She spoke about the guilt that haunted every moment of joy with Emma, about feeling like she didn't deserve happiness after what she had done to her first child. Sarah described the nursery they had prepared for Michael, painted blue with glow-in-the-dark, stars on the ceiling. She talked about the mobile with wooden airplanes that they had bought for their son who would never see it. She wept for the first steps he would never take, the first words he would never speak, the hugs she would never receive. "I told myself I was being merciful," Sarah whispered through her tears. "But what if I was just being cowardly? What if I didn't give him a chance to prove the doctors wrong? What if I killed my son because it was easier than fighting for him?" Isabella listened, without judgment, holding Emma as the baby's cries gradually softened to whimpers for the first time in hours. When Sarah finished her confession, Isabella shared her own story with equal vulnerability. She had lost a baby, too, during her 2nd year in America when she was 19 and alone, a miscarriage at 5 months that left her devastated and guilt-ridden in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language. "I blamed myself for everything," Isabella said softly. "For the stress of immigration, for working too hard, for not having enough money for proper medical care. I carried that baby's loss like a stone in my chest for years. It wasn't until I understood that grief needs to be honored, not hidden, that I could start healing." Isabella explained that in her culture, lost children were acknowledged and remembered, not forgotten in service of moving forward. "Grief that doesn't have a voice finds other ways to speak," she said, looking meaningfully at Emma, who had gone quiet in her arms. "Sometimes it speaks through our living children because they love us enough to carry what we can't bear alone." That night, Isabella made an unprecedented suggestion. She asked David and Sarah to hold Emma together while she guided them through acknowledging Michael's existence and their continuing love for him, not as a mistake or a tragedy that needed to be overcome, but as their first child who they had loved enough to spare from suffering. David initially resisted the idea as unscientific nonsense that couldn't possibly help a medical problem, but Sarah's desperation and Isabella's quiet confidence convinced him to try something that went against every logical instinct he possessed. They sat together on Emma's nursery floor at midnight, their daughter between them, and talked about Michael, for the first time since the day they lost him. The conversation was halting at first, filled with tears and long silences, but gradually became a celebration of the son they had loved and lost. Sarah spoke about the dreams she had harbored for Michael, the way she had imagined teaching him to walk, to read, to ride a bicycle. She described the nursery she had prepared with such hope and the way she had talked to him every day during the pregnancy. She admitted that she still sometimes caught herself buying 2 birthday cards in October before remembering that Michael would never have birthdays to celebrate. David admitted that he had grieved too, in his own way, by burying himself in work to avoid facing the magnitude of their loss. He talked about the college fund he had started for Michael, which still existed untouched in a bank account he couldn't bring himself to close. He spoke about the guilt he carried for feeling relieved when the pregnancy ended, even though he knew the relief came from love, not callousness. Emma's crying didn't stop immediately, but something fundamental shifted in the room's atmosphere. The oppressive heaviness that had seemed to press down on the household like a physical weight began to lift. Isabella noticed it first, then Sarah, and finally David, who felt something he couldn't name releasing its hold on his chest. Over. The next week, Isabella worked with the family to create a memorial for Michael that acknowledged his place in their family without making his absence a source of ongoing pain. Not a shrine that would become a focus of perpetual grief, but a gentle recognition that he had existed and been deeply loved. They planted a Japanese maple tree in the corner of the garden where morning light filtered through the surrounding oaks. The tree was small but strong, with leaves that would turn brilliant red each autumn in memory of their son. At its base, they placed a simple stone engraved with Michael David Henderson, forever in our hearts, loved beyond measure. The memorial ceremony was private and simple. Isabella guided them through lighting candles and sharing memories of their hopes for Michael, then ceremonially releasing him from their guilty protection so that Emma could be free to be herself, without carrying her brother's unlived life. The breakthrough came 3 days later, on that Tuesday night at 3:47 a.m., when Isabella's whispered words in Spanish finally gave Emma permission to let go of her family's grief. The breakthrough came 3 days later, on that Tuesday night at 3:47 a.m., when Isabella's whispered words in Spanish finally gave Emma permission to let go of her family's grief. Emma had been crying for hours, despite every attempt to comfort her. Sarah was beyond exhaustion, barely able to stand upright. David paced the hallway, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under months of helplessness and failure. Isabella entered the nursery and took Emma from Sarah's trembling arms. She walked to the large window that overlooked the garden, where Michael's tree stood silhouetted in the moonlight, its small branches reaching toward the stars. Holding Emma close against her chest, Isabella whispered the 3 words that would change everything. Dile a tu hermano que está bien. Dile que mamá y papá lo aman y que está bien que seas feliz. Tell your brother. It's okay. Tell him that mommy and daddy love him and that it's okay for you to be happy. Emma's screaming stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with the slow wind down of exhaustion that they had witnessed countless times before, but immediately and completely. The silence was so sudden and profound that Sarah and David froze, hardly daring to breathe for fear of breaking whatever spell Isabella had cast. Emma looked up at Isabella with clear, focused eyes that seemed far older than her 6 months, then turned toward her parents with an expression of profound peace and recognition. For the first time since her crying had begun, Emma reached out her tiny hands towards Sarah, not in distress or demand, but in simple love and connection. Sarah collapsed to her knees beside David, both of them sobbing with relief, understanding, and overwhelming gratitude. Their daughter hadn't been sick, or damaged, or difficult. She hadn't been rejecting them or punishing them. She had been trying to help them heal from a wound they hadn't even acknowledged existed, carrying their unspoken grief until someone could help them understand it wasn't hers to bear. In the days that followed, Emma transformed completely into the happy, content baby they had always hoped for, but never dared believe possible. She slept peacefully through the night in her beautiful nursery, no longer tormented by the unexpressed emotions that had surrounded her since birth. During the day, she smiled and laughed, responding to her parents' voices with joy instead of inconsolable crying. The change in Emma reflected an equally dramatic transformation in her parents and their home. Sarah began eating again, sleeping again, and looking in mirrors without seeing a stranger staring back. The constant tension lines around her eyes softened, and the tremor in her hands disappeared. She started talking to David again, not about medical appointments and failed solutions, but about their hopes and dreams for Emma's future. David began coming home at reasonable hours, eager to spend time with his daughter and reconnect with his wife. The distance between them that had grown wider each day began closing as they learned to share their feelings honestly instead of protecting each other from difficult emotions. The Henderson household staff began returning to their positions, drawn by reports of the miraculous change in the family's circumstances. Maria Santos requested reassignment back to the mansion, and James Wright returned to tend the gardens where Michael's memorial tree was beginning to put out new growth. Isabella stayed with the Henderson family for 6 more months, not as an emergency hire fighting an impossible crisis, but as a cherished member of their household, who helped them establish healthy patterns of communication and emotional honesty. She taught Sarah and David to recognize and address difficult feelings before they could build up into destructive forces. During her time with the family, Isabella also pursued her own healing and professional development. With Sarah's encouragement and David's financial support, she enrolled in a grief counseling program at UCLA, Extension, studying the psychological and cultural aspects of loss and recovery. She learned to blend her intuitive understanding of children and families with formal training in trauma and bereavement. Isabella's work with the Hendersons became the foundation for her own family support practice, which she launched after leaving their employment. Word spread quietly through Beverly Hills and the surrounding communities about the woman who could help families heal from losses they didn't know they were carrying. Her client list grew to include other wealthy families struggling with infertility, pregnancy loss, adoption trauma, and the complex emotions that money couldn't solve. When Isabella finally left the Henderson household to start her independent practice, the goodbye was tearful but celebratory. Sarah and David had become different people, stronger and more connected than they had been even before their losses. Their marriage was built on a foundation of honest communication and mutual support rather than shared avoidance of difficult truths. Emma grew up knowing about her brother Michael through age-appropriate stories that honored his place in their family without making his absence a source of guilt or sadness. On his birthday each year, they visited his memorial tree in the garden and shared memories of how much he was loved, even in his brief existence. Emma learned that families could include both living and departed members, and that love was large, enough to encompass both presence and absence without conflict. 3 years later, when Sarah gave birth to their son, James Michael Henderson, the birth was celebrated not as a replacement for their first son, but as an addition to their family that already included a daughter who had taught them about unconditional love, and a son who had taught them about the courage required for impossible choices. The delivery was peaceful, and baby James entered, the world welcomed by parents who had learned to embrace both joy and sorrow as essential parts of love. Emma, now almost 4 years old, was thrilled to have a baby brother and showed no signs of the sensitivity to family emotions that had marked her own infancy. She had done her work of healing her family's wounded hearts, and now she was free to be simply a happy child. Isabella attended James's christening as an honored guest, watching the family she had helped heal celebrate their newest member with pure joy, unmarked by hidden grief or guilty secrets. The ceremony took place in the garden near Michael's tree, which had grown tall and strong, its red autumn leaves brilliant against the California sky. Isabella Martinez, the night maid who became a healer, had understood something that all the medical specialists and expensive equipment had missed. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions fail because they address the wrong problems. Emma's crying hadn't been a symptom of illness or dysfunction, but a communication of profound love. She had been asking her parents to include her brother in their story so that she could be free to write her own. The Henderson family's transformation became a quiet testimony to the power of acknowledging grief rather than hiding from it. Their story spread through their social circles, leading other families to seek Isabella's help with their own unresolved losses and communication barriers. The mansion that had once been filled with desperate silence, except for Emma's cries, became a gathering place for charity work, focused on supporting families through pregnancy loss and infant bereavement. David often reflected on how close they had come to missing the real solution. All the money, medical expertise, and technological resources in the world couldn't substitute for someone who understood that babies sometimes cry, not because something is wrong with them, but because something needs healing in their world. The most expensive consultations had been useless compared to Isabella's simple wisdom about the connection between unexpressed grief and infant distress. Sarah resumed her nursing career part-time, specializing in supporting families through difficult pregnancies and neonatal loss. Her experience with Michael and Emma gave her a unique ability to help other parents navigate impossible choices and complex emotions. She became known for her compassionate presence during families' darkest moments, offering hope born from her own journey through grief to healing. Isabella's 3 whispered words in Spanish had done more than quiet a crying baby. They had given a family permission to love completely, without the shadow of unexpressed grief limiting their capacity for joy. In teaching them to honor their lost son, she had freed their living daughter to become exactly who she was meant to be a happy, loved child whose existence could celebrate both presence and absence without conflict. The marble corridors of the Henderson mansion still echo occasionally with children's voices, but now they carry laughter, conversation, and the normal sounds of a family that has learned to embrace both joy and sorrow as essential parts of love. Emma and James play in the garden where their brother's tree grows taller each year, a living reminder that some gifts come through endings, and some healers arrive disguised as ordinary people who simply understand that love is large enough to hold everything, including loss. In quiet moments, when the children are sleeping and the house is peaceful, Sarah and David sometimes stand together at their bedroom window, looking out at Michael's tree in the moonlight. They no longer feel guilt or regret when they think of their first son, only gratitude for the love that made an impossible choice bearable, and for the daughter whose cries led them back to wholeness. And somewhere in the distance, they can hear Isabella's voice whispering in Spanish to another family in crisis, teaching them that healing begins when we stop hiding from love's most difficult truths.